from Earth and Environmental Science with a specialization in geography from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Before that, he has done so many things. He's worked as a journalist, as a reporter, and he has lived in Lebanon for a couple of years. And he has published a number of papers, co-edited a book, Beyond the Square, Urbanism and the Arab Uprising, that came out in 2016, and Open Gaza, which will be published in December of 2018. He has written for a number of publications, including Jadaliyya, Portal 9, the Arab Studies Journal, and The Guardian. I don't know if you can see the pattern. They belong in a certain direction that is the one that I lead, in a sense. Hope all of you also do the same thing. He has also worked for several UN agencies, including UNDP and UN Habitat, and also for governments and international NGOs. And before that, when he was a freelance journalist, he spent most of the time in Lebanon, and he also, and he is also the co-director of Terraform, the Center for Advanced Urban Research in New York. And his lecture today is entitled Lebanon and the Fog of Reconstruction Between the Future and Survival. I hope all of you are on our mailing list, so you have received the abstract, because if some of you are not on the mailing list, you're going to have to endure me reading the abstract for a couple of minutes. Do we need the abstract to be read? Or are we fine? We will hear it from the podium. Let's stop recording. So please join me in welcoming Dean.
Well, thank you, Nas, for that very generous introduction. And just to say thank you to yourself and to Jim and Jose, and also it's been wonderful to meet Alison, my fellow postdoc. I think, the first time I walked into the office here, and Jose and I got straight into a conversation and debate about I don't know what, but it was wonderful to think, okay, I'm at home. I know that there are people that love to debate the problems of the world and go off on various rants, and I felt very much at home from the very minute I walked in. And just to say that it's an extra privilege to present on Lebanon at MIT because it has an enormous heritage here of Lebanon studies, or Beirut studies, if you like, that I'm genuinely very honoured to be a part of, especially as someone that is adopted kind of Beirut as a city. It's really, David Harvey in Limits to Capital said that everyone who studies Marx feels compelled to write a book about the experience. And it's very much how I feel about living, studying, and working in Beirut. It has been and continues to be a really profound experience, and both in the best of ways and equally the worst. It is a difficult place to get your head around, as people from Beirut will tell you, and those from outside, such as myself. So, to today's talk. The end of the ferocious violence of the last stage of the Lebanese civil war, the so-called War of Liberation, finally brought the 17-year civil war to a close in 1991. The third and final attempt at reconstruction could begin. But even before the reconstruction started, it was marred in controversy. Accusations of corruption and foul play swirled. The reconstruction has continued to this day to be highly divisive in Lebanon. The film The Man with the Golden Shoes by the late Syrian director Omar Amiralai begins with the central issue that divided Lebanese society over the reconstruction.
The first thing that comes to mind when we talk about the central district of Beirut is that a private company is doing it. Why? Why Solidere? Why this private company? Why not the government doing all this? You should really try to imagine what we started off with.
So, Solidere transformed the entire Beirut Central District into a joint stock corporation. 1.8 million square meters and an additional 600,000 square meters of reclaimed land. In September 1994, the Lebanese elite gathered for the inauguration of Solidaire. The president, along with speakers drawn from the country's religious and political elite, took it in turns to endorse and sing the praises of Solidaire's foremost supporter, a majority shareholder, Prime Minister Rafik Hariri. He was also a billionaire contractor with Saudi citizenship. And Solidaire became the centerpiece, basically, for the post-Taif reconstruction for the whole of Lebanon. It was a land and real estate developer, or rather is, property owner, property and service manager and operator that created a high-quality urban structure in the Beirut Central District and created new infrastructural connections. The world's most prominent architects contributed to the formation of this new Beirut Central District, including Zaha Hadid, Herzog van der Meulen, Norman Foster, Jean Nouvel, and Stephen Holt. But neither the deployment of the latest techniques in urban planning or the world's most famous architects have been able to produce a socially and politically coherent and cohesive urban fabric. The claims that Solidaire would be the engine for the broader national economy have rung hollow. Solidaire is now an exclusive and high-end urban core with pristine but empty streets and apartments that now stand in stark contrast to the deteriorating and congested urban fabric of the rest of the city. It is, as a former employee of Solidaire told me, a paradise in a box. But it is a paradise that many in Lebanon continue to blame for the increasing deterioration of the broader urban fabric. This cooperation and reconstruction process is blamed for increasing urban inequalities in Beirut and Lebanon more broadly, the crisis of basic urban services such as electricity and water, access to affordable housing, and contributing to the garbage crisis. In the summer of 2015, the inability of the Lebanese political elite to agree on how to manage Beirut's garbage crisis resulted in the city's main landfill shutting down without a viable alternative. The anger of the city's residents at the political elite and system that was now literally, as well as symbolically, poisoning them, reached a boiling point. So throughout August and September 2015, thousands of protesters gathered in Martyrs Square in the Beirut Central District. But in addition to protesting, the inhabitants of Beirut also tried to reclaim the center of Beirut, where they set up stalls, selling clothes, art, plants, and offered haircuts for $4, and sold popular Lebanese foods such as falafel, sarge, and fruit juices. All this was in very stark contrast to the otherwise area populated with major corporations and restaurants that sold meals for perhaps $50 a head. A spokesperson for the NGO Bidna Nahasib, We Want Accountability, said that they were trying to open the area to all people. There used to be thousands of companies, he said before, but now there are no more than 100. So notably, the protesters not only directed their anger at a sectarian elite, but also against a corporation now, and the corporatization of the entire heart of Beirut. But the question of why Solidaire has not been answered satisfactorily. Why was a joint stock corporation with its absentee ownership, shareholding model, managerial structure, monopoly power and annual reports utilized to lead the reconstruction process? So this was a central question that I began in writing my doctoral thesis. And it's important to note that the joint stock corporation is unusual for Lebanon, and at the time of Solidaire in the Middle East more broadly. Most businesses are family run, and there's a saying that the Lebanese economy is made up of around 100 million families. But there's also importantly a distrust towards the joint stock corporation. Famously in 1966, the Intrabank joint stock corporation collapsed, and this threatened the entire Lebanese elite, and is still very much part of Lebanese daily discourse. And that memory of the loss of wealth and general disaster that Intrabank caused is still very present. So it was very unusual to a certain extent that a joint stock corporation should be used to lead the reconstruction, and at the time was one of the largest single urban development corporations in the world. So in my dissertation, I analysed the longue durée of the corporation. I tried try and place Solidaire not only in the context of the Eastern Mediterranean, but more historically, globally. I mean, in particular with the rise in Europe. So after the collapse of the Roman Empire, you see in the 11th century that corporate towns start to emerge with their corporate charters. And these corporate charters allowed them to make their own laws, create their own and hold their own markets. They could mint their own coins and even have their own standing armies. Lewis Mumford famously said, "One lived and died in the identifiable style of one's class and one's corporation." So the corporation enabled a formation of a sense of collective belonging and, importantly, the extensions of certain forms of social power. Following these kind of medieval corporations, you see the emergence of the trading companies, with Europe's turn to empire in the 16th century, and of course then the famous rise of the East India companies in Britain and in Holland, and then later in France. And these were really the formations of the first joint stock corporations. And they've always had a very important material urban aspect to them. Of course, corporations like the Massachusetts Bay Company, for instance, that set up colonial towns such as the Massachusetts Bay Colony with its centre as Boston. And this, I think, is a well-known history that replicates itself throughout the United States. And indeed, the US Constitution, not only, although it doesn't mention the corporation, it's important to note that these corporate charters from things such as the Massachusetts Bay Company was central to that document. And of course, the US flag is derivative of the East India Company itself. So there was always this very strong association between the corporation and forms of colonization. And the corporation was both a way to extend power, but also for monarchs to delegate it. And so then in the 1800s, the modern corporation begins to form. And again, urban space and infrastructure is essential. The railways were the teething ground for modern forms of corporate organization and the birth of managerial capitalism. These administrative structures formed to manage the extensive geography of the railway and the need for complex forms of coordination to ensure the flow of carriages and goods. So I'm not going to go into the depths of my thesis too much, but I really want to just emphasize 4 aspects in relation to the corporation. The first, in terms of what a corporation is and what it does. A corporation binds people, space, and things together for one group or association to gain power over another. The second key takeaway I want to emphasize is that corporations have a long and strong association with the durable structures of the urban fabric. So through the capitalization of the built environment, it has been a key way in which future income has been moved into the present. Real estate, for example, is not valued on what it costs to build, but the present value of 50 years of living in that space. The third thing is that the corporation is not automatically or necessarily the market. The corporation is rather the internalization of transactions conducted within the confines of a corporation, rather than having them done within the open market. There's an important distinction there to be made. And finally, and as the question was set up in Omar Amirali's film, it isn't the corporations or the state. Corporations have been instrumental to the formation of states and the expansion of their social power. So the corporation and the state are co-productions. The railway corporations and the modern American state is one key example. But of course, for today's talk, I want to argue that Solidaire and the Lebanese Second Republic were equally co-productions. Now, this is the capitalization of Solidaire and then Lebanon more broadly. And I'll come to try and explain some of the elements of this. But what did it mean to turn the downtown area of Beirut into a corporation? It meant the capitalization of that space. And that entailed exchanging property rights of owners in the Beirut Central District with shares in the corporations. So property right holders were given an opportunity to accumulate capital in the future of the very entity that was dispossessing them of those rights. So as a result, a stock market was re-established alongside Solidaire, and that enabled them to constitutionally do this transfer of property rights for shares, and Solidaire was made the central, what is called a blue chip stock. But as the Lebanese economist Shahbal Nahas told me, the stock market is a complete joke. And if you look at and try and understand then this capitalization, it does look very odd. I mean, as you can see from Solidaire very quickly, is that we have a share valuation that is pretty much, and if you take in for inflation as well, a lot lower than when we started. And equally, there's no real economic rationale around the fluctuations in valuation. But if you track the kind of various political events, you can see a very strong association between incredible tensions rising and a large investment of capital and values rising. I could talk for 40 minutes over this graph. Unfortunately, I haven't got that luxury. So I'm just trying to highlight some very particular elements of those relationships there to say that these trends are very much linked to socio and political processes rather than anything to do with the market. And that is very important. It is only when one turns to questions of social power that you can really start to understand some of these elements. And indeed, the formation of Solidaire, I argue, was one of the most important institutional transformations in the creation of Lebanon's Second Republic that followed the formal end of the Civil War. And it was also the center of key political, economic, and social struggles. So this is all the more remarkable given the fact that this corporation, or the reconstruction process more broadly, wasn't really detailed or mentioned at all in the Ta'if Accord that ended the Civil War. That was otherwise very precise in the division of powers between different factions. So the claim was that Solidaire would propel the whole of the Lebanese economy towards greater prosperity, and a massive campaign was launched to sell the idea of Solidaire as the future. And although there's a lot of literature on Solidaire, no one has really gone into depth in its formation as a corporation, its capitalization, and its relationship to built space. So this is what I was really trying to tease out. And I learnt a lot on old institutionalism, particularly the work of Thorstein Veblen and more recent work by Nielsen and Wickler, and their focus on capitalization. So Veblen laid the foundations for institutional economics. He replaced the concept of people as the makers of economic decisions with the idea that people are affected by changing institutions. So Veblen observed that the rise of the business corporation meant that financial capital had overpowered industrial capitalism. The corporation's absentee ownership structure marked the transition from the focus of making things to making money. So Veblen stressed that the modern corporation had more to do with the organization of social power than with economic efficiency or the production of material goods. So the critical idea here is that social power itself can create value. And Nielsen and Wickler, understanding capital as power, a power that is wielded through the corporation and its central process of capitalization. So at the center of a corporation's operation is capitalization. This is the universal creed of capitalism. It is the value of a future stream of earnings. It tells us how much a capitalist is prepared to pay now to receive money later. But for the old institutions, people like Veblen, but also more recent work by Nielsen and Wickler, this capitalization is merely a symbolic representation of power. Veblen, for instance, insists that the corporation is about the organization of social power, not material goods or entities. So it's a very dematerialized concept, which is a bit difficult for someone like myself that's focused on the urban environment and its control of our social life and is trying to understand how we get these productions of spaces that control so much of our futures and social life. So to try and draw in the material, I lent a lot and followed the work of Timothy Mitchell and the broader collective of science and technology studies, and also more contemporary work in geography. Because the built environment is one of the central processes, have become central to the process of capitalisation. The future has entered the present material structure of the city in an unprecedented way. And indeed, the corporation, as I mentioned before, has a long association with urban structures that provide durable structures for this future income to be shifted into the present. So fundamentally, so I've tried to understand this through this concept that I've tried to put together in the thesis called capitalised urbanisation. This is the extension of time, the future, through the concentration of space urbanisation. And importantly, this is not only an economic proposition, but it also necessitates socio-political and spatial control to ensure that taxes, laws, zoning, fiscal and monetary policies, wants, needs and desires are aligned to ensure this constant flow of future income is sustained through present space. And to kind of really materialise this argument, I focus on Solidaire, but also this 19th century corporation in Lebanon, who's the Beirut-Damascus highway, that I argue was also very central to the expansion of French power in Lebanon and the very rise of Beirut as a notable trading hub along the eastern Mediterranean coast. So I argue that capitalised urbanisation has been key to ways in which social life has been organised and certain futures controlled. And I hope this is going to open new theoretical pathways to understanding the vast capitalisation of our urban present, something that I'll come back to at the end. But I'm not going to focus too much on explaining this argument, because I really want to focus and respect the theme of this lecture series, and what we've come here to talk about is this reconstruction and these broader understandings of urbanisation and violence, and how violence and conflict really enter our urban fabrics. So as I say in the abstract, I really want to disrupt the association between Reconstruction and post-conflict eras, and thinking of Reconstruction as something that is simply generative and restorative. War can produce and construct a distinct type of military urbanisation and urban form, and likewise, the reconstruction of the built environment can also result in violence, displacement, and social discord. So in the case of Lebanon, many have mourned the loss of a certain Beirut, not due to the violence of the civil war, necessarily, but due to high-end urban development projects, specifically ones like Solidaire. And indeed, much of the destruction of the Ottoman, French, and more contemporary Lebanese modernist heritage was not in active fighting, but due to clear-up operations to prepare or actively engage in the so-called reconstruction. So by rethinking what we understand by reconstruction, I'm trying to think of urban violence and conflict not through the destruction of the built environment, but through active construction and organisation of urban space. Now this is a growing theme in urban studies. I would say it's still in its infancy, and there's still a lot of work to be done. But I think two notable people that have worked a lot on this is Eyal Weizman and Stephen Graham, who've both really tried to detail how urban warfare increasingly comes to resemble urban planning. And they have also done important work noting how armies have established research programs to train their own urban practitioners. And also Jennifer Light here at MIT has written an important book on military war games by the RAND Corporation, but also those developed here at MIT, and their concerns about national security that have been central to shaping the American built environment, such as suburbanization and urban sprawl, that have also, of course, had global implications. In Lebanon specifically, two very recent books have just come out that both also try and extend this theme of the idea of paramilitary strategies that get embedded with the urban planning process, with zoning, and the construction of infrastructures and the provision of basic urban services. Now, when thinking about the histories of the corporation and Solidaire, it's important to note that Solidaire was not the first time that a corporation has been central to, say, shaping social life in the Eastern Mediterranean. Corporations have a long history in the region. The first corporations that entered in the 16th century carved out territories that gave Europeans certain trading privileges. They were known as echelles. The very rise of Beirut as a significant trading hub, I argue, was due to a corporation. The Compagnie Impériale Ottomane de la Rue Beirut-Damas, that was formed in 1857, founded by two French brothers and known as the French Road, was important to a very competitive Eastern Mediterranean, in which enabled Beirut to really propel itself above the others, and also enabled to a certain extent the expansion of French power in the Levant. But it's important to stress that joint stock corporations were not widely utilised by newly independent Arab states. There is a notable absence until quite recently of major corporations founded within the Arab region. But since the 1990s, this corporate power has expanded rapidly, and that Solidaire is an important market in that respect. I apologise for the quality of this image, but the main message that I want to communicate for you is just that Solidaire is not just a space, it's also this administrative managerial structure. And that Solidaire really utilised the full apparatus of the joint stock corporation. That included the ability to centralise capital and property from hundreds of thousands of entities into a single corporate unit through shareholding. That it utilised monopoly power, absentee ownership and the continuity of existence beyond individual owners and managers. That it utilised this managerial structure with its professional class and board of directors. That it had annual and quarterly reports, costs of repairs and work done, and as many corporations do, had enormous government subsidies and support, and as well as creating this new spatial order. So, bringing then this work, this idea of Solidaire together and this new work in urban studies, thinking through how urban planning and the built environment can be part of warfare. It's important to start to set out that I am not arguing that a certain type of socio-political and economic as well as material rebuilding did not occur with the Solidaire reconstruction, or that the open violence of the Civil War did not end. The signing of the Taif Peace Accords in 1989 did eventually mark a new era in the country. But certain conflicts mutated into the processes of urbanisation and reconstruction. Solidaire and the broader reconstruction that emerged should perhaps be understood as much as a rearrangement of socio-political life for one group to gain power over another, rather than merely as a rebuilding in a post-war phase. And indeed, one of the first infrastructural projects that Solidaire undertook was to build a trench around its territory that was now the Beirut Central District. And indeed, the Civil War, which was a 17-year conflict, was devastating. It left over 130,000 dead, and the World Bank estimated a quarter of the population displaced. War produced dramatic changes to the urban geography of Lebanon and Beirut's role as the socio-economic and political metropole that was replaced by no less than 10 militia-controlled cantons, built around several newly constructed ports along the Lebanese coast. The Civil War entailed the destruction of the built environment, but it importantly produced a certain type of military urbanisation. Urbanisation, for instance, was central for militias who wanted to shift rural populations into the city to facilitate the acquisition of religiously homogeneous socio-geographical spaces. Militias used the provision of basic urban services as a strategy of control and intimidation of both their own population and others. The absence of government supervision
also meant that developers were keen to exploit land beyond permitted or appropriate legal restrictions. Bernard Khoury, a notable Lebanese architect, told me that Beirut did not stop its development during the war years. In fact, development was accelerated by the fact that the centre of the city was voided out. Beirut grew in the absence of any master plan or any sort of regulating mechanism. And from the statistics that we do have from the Lebanese Civil War, the construction sector was one of the few to expand during this period. The World Bank, for instance, states that in 1974, the construction sector was around $141 million. It's around 4% of GDP. By 1988, this had risen to 328 million, which is around 10% of GDP. So war may be the enemy of a plural city, but it is not antithetical to the extension of urbanization. And as Samir Khalaf has noted in the context of Lebanon, the war produced its own lexicon and iconography of places. So the construction of the built environment and control of mobility, in particular within urban areas, can be used to impose violence on others. And the reconstruction, I'm arguing, was a means through which many conflicts could continue. The Taif Agreement that formally ended the civil war, it's important to note, was not a final definitive resolution of the conflict, but really a precarious one that halted direct conflict. And the deal constructed around the accord was that Syria would allow the Saudi-American envoy Rafiq Hariri to lead the economy and reconstruction process, while the Syrians controlled security and foreign policy. And it's important to note that the complexity of the Lebanese civil wars meant that at several moments when open conflict had halted, the inhabitants and even the government thought that the civil war was over and reconstruction could begin, only for conflict to resume. The reconstruction that began at Taif and placed Solidaire and the BCD at its centre was the third notable attempt at rebuilding. And the 1991 reconstruction that resulted in the establishment of Solidaire cannot be understood independently from these previous overlapping attempts at rebuilding. I'm going to take you through very briefly some of these various stages and just note some of their significant aspects. So in 1977, the first plan for reconstruction went into effect, and the war started in 1975. And this also importantly put in place the Council for Development and Reconstruction, the CDR, which would be a very important mechanism that Hariri used in the Solidaire reconstruction. And even in 77, it was created as a super ministry, one that was effectively able to circumvent Parliament and was given extensive power for planning, financing, including borrowing and lending powers, execution, and the supervision of all reconstruction programs. And it was very clear even at 77 that the reconstruction was being used to enforce certain political factions' stability within a very fragmented political scene. But conflict indeed did return, and it wasn't until 1983 that a halt to fighting once again meant that reconstruction and implementation was rapidly put together. And it was in this period that Rafiq Hariri, through the built environment and his corporation known as Auger Liban, began to establish itself. And in this period, for instance, trucks from Auger Liban cleared rubble away from the streets for free, with banners saying courtesy of Rafiq Hariri. But the then president, Amin Gemayel, had his own designs for the reconstruction phase at that point for the northern coastline. And there was a clear competition between Hariri, who was more focused on the downtown area, and Gemayel, that was more focused on this northern littoral. But at this time, a new set of plans was created by Dar al-Handasa in '83, funded and commissioned by Auger Liban. And these would be basically the foundations for what was the eventual formation of Solidaire and the Hariri-led reconstruction. But it's also important to note that in this period, Auger Liban undertook extensive demolitions of the downtown area in the name of reconstructing damaged buildings. And a number of scholars have documented how much of the most extensive destruction of downtown Beirut did not occur in the context of open conflict, but rather in periods of peace in the name of reconstruction, specifically in 1983, but then again in 1986, and then finally in 1992. Auger-les-Bains is accused of destroying many significant buildings in the downtown area during these various operations. But in 1983, conflict once again returned to Lebanon. It was at this time that Hariri began to increase his public diplomatic role, with his participation as the Saudi envoy in the National Dialogue peace talks in Geneva. It was at this point in the conflict that a different logic established itself, as the economist Charbel Nahas told me. Now no one wanted to come back. It was a much more ambitious approach that was needed, he said, to justify the re-centralization of the city. So at some point around 86, 87, Hariri's Auger-les-Bains created a new alternative master plan for the Beirut Central District that for the first time introduced an upmarket private development and joint stock corporation for the entire downtown area. This third set of plans would result in the establishment of the Joint Stock Corporation, but would have to wait until the War of Liberation ended. And although the Taif Agreement was signed in 1989, this last episode of the Civil War was its most brutal. It killed an estimated 1,000 civilians and resulted in the mass displacement and extensive destruction in and around Beirut. An IMF report notes that 1990 was possibly the worst year for the economy since the conflict began. Unlike in the 1982 conflict that was centered, this one was centered in East Beirut and the surrounding areas, where there is a heavy concentration of industrial and financial activity. But the War of Liberation was the final act of the open conflict of the Civil War. The geopolitical climate with the end of the Cold War, Syria's participation in the UN operation to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, and Iranian power in remission meant that the start of the Taif era could begin in earnest by the start of 1991. Although Solidaire or the broader reconstruction of the built environment was not mentioned in the Taif agreement, it was part of the horse trading between competing Lebanese elites and their international backers. As soon as the conflict halted in December 1990, a rapid political, legal, and economic mobilization occurred for the reconstruction effort led by Hariri and the corporations associated with it. That included Auger-les-Bains, Dar al-Handasa, and the American Bechtel Corporation, a corporation that has been responsible for forming much of the built environment of the Middle East that has been vastly understudied. But in the summer of 1991, a new master plan, paid for by Hariri, was launched by Dar al-Handasa, led by the prominent Lebanese architect Henri Ede, and became known as the Ede Plan. The Ede Plan created a spectacular new vision for the downtown area. The city was to be built around three major axes, the most prominent of which was to be a boulevard 10 meters wider than the Champs-Élysées. Most buildings would be 10 to 20 stories high, with a 40-story World Trade Center as the centerpiece. Soon after this plan was announced, in December 91, Law 117 was passed that created the legal framework for a real estate company to be involved in the reconstruction of the BCD area, and enabled the transfer of property rights for shares, an expropriation of property that went to great lengths to be framed not as an expropriation. Law 117 was passed under highly controversial circumstances, and it's very clear from the parliamentary debates at the time that the institutional setup underlying this plan was very unclear to those that were due to pass this law. MPs did not understand or had not been informed if one corporation was engaged in the reconstruction or several, why this corporate model was being utilised, and what it meant to give the monopoly of the downtown area to this single corporation, if it was indeed to be a single one. Soon after 117 was passed, further demolition of the Beirut Central District occurred, even though the reconstruction plan had yet to be approved or defined. In parallel to the master plan and the passing of 117, the CDR agreed to a $7 million study funded by the Hariri Foundation and created by the Bechtel Group. The plan culminated in the Horizon 2000 for the reconstruction and development of Lebanon that envisioned a $12 billion national reconstruction and placed what would become Solidaire at its centre. And it's important that Solidaire was at the centre of a national reconstruction plan. Very much Beirut and the national territory was organised around this logic of this Beirut, of this business district, this corporate business district. So in this period of 91 to 94, a heated public debate did emerge that concentrated on the plans proposed for Beirut and the scheme to turn the entire Beirut Central District into a real estate corporation. Architects and urbanists, most notably Nabil Layham, Asim Salam and Jal Tabit, but also owners of property in the downtown area, led a real opposition to the Ede plan and the reconstruction plans more broadly. The Ede plan, as Sari Makdisi wrote, was unanimously denounced as an outrageous rebuilding project to follow the virtual total demolition of whatever structures remained in the city centre. And critics also cited the conflict of interest that Hariri had as someone running to be Prime Minister and as someone in direct control of several corporations that intended to lead the reconstruction. But it's important to note that there were also supporters of this project. They argued that a single private company was the only viable option in the context of a fractured government in which there was popular distrust and inadequate public funds. And supporters also viewed the transfer of property rights from owners to the real estate company as the only way to reclaim property from squatters and to initiate the reconstruction of the downtown area that was estimated to have 250,000 property right claimants. MIT was a notable place of debate. There were really three centres, here in London as well, and then of course Beirut itself. Maha Yehya, who did her doctoral studies here, from my knowledge, was the first to kind of really do a full-scale doctoral study of the reconstruction. And in terms of this book was among, I think, 4 publications that were systematic studies of the proposed reconstruction. And already then, it was pretty clear how processes of warfare or militarized urbanisms were embedding themselves in the corporation, or in the reconstruction. As Maha Yehya notes in this book, the research program is transformed into the most obvious access route into the closed power circle of the politics of war. And meanwhile in Beirut, although they also contributed to this book, Bayham, Salam and Tabit co-edited a book called Construct the Future or Reconstruct the Past, which was funded by the Ford Foundation, that really put forward a set of alternative options for how the reconstruction could proceed in a more socially harmonious fashion. And I think it's really important to emphasize the existence of that book and that group of scholars and architects and urbanists that were making these alternative arguments, because it's often put forward that there were no alternative ideas at the time, that Hariri had kind of put a plan forward, there was nothing else, and it was the only thing that was feasible. But I think this was a set of circumstances that was also in part created by Hariri. For instance, the Lebanese economist Kamal Hamdan, who contributed a chapter to the book that Bayham, Salam and Tabit put together, told me in an interview that when the book was published, it disappeared off the bookshelves. He said Hariri had bought them all. The opposition to the Ede plan, however, did result in the plans being reformulated. Ede resigned over what he stated was his own naivety regarding Hariri's intentions and his own intentions to protect his client, that he said was the state. A new plan was formulated. Significantly, this new master plan did not address any of the urban governance issues, any of the economic or legal concerns raised by opponents of the master plan. But it did take into critique the critiques over the physical form. So the new master plan for Beirut consciously bolstered the historical fabric of the city. One, it should be stressed that Auger-les-Bains had, by 1992, largely destroyed. And it drew explicitly from the urban design movement of New Urbanism and Kevin Lynch's The Image of the City. In October 1992, the government approved a new master plan, which was then endorsed by the CDR a year later. By 1994, Solidaire was officially inaugurated. Now, a number of scholars have detailed how the Solidaire reconstruction process was part of an intricate set of flow of rents to a small echelon of elites. And this was created through compensation, through treasury bills, high interest rates, tax avoidance, and real estate speculation. I think these are the two most notable book publications, but there have also been, more recently, a slew of PhD dissertations that have come out in the last couple of years. So collectively, this scholarship has pointed towards how the Solidaire-led reconstruction process has been a major contributor to Lebanon's public debt burden that is close to reaching 140% of GDP in 2018. That is the third highest among all rated sovereigns, and the collapse of its basic urban services and the extreme levels of socio-inequality and polarization within Lebanon. A new study just published last year has shown how the top 1% in Lebanon is estimated to receive 25% of national income, and the top 10% of that, another 25%. This places Lebanon among the highest in the world in terms of income concentration. Much of this inequality is concentrated in the built environment. So the physical reconstruction was central to the ability of Hariri to accumulate the kind of social power that he was able to do. And it was indeed, in some sense, a remarkable in a violently fractured Lebanese context. As Paul Salem has noted, never has one individual wielded such a combination of public and private power in modern Lebanon as Hariri. And notably, the seemingly dispersed ownership of the downtown area, now through shareholding, was widely viewed as a charade. Rather than owned by thousands of shareholders, most of the shareholdings ended up in the hands of the Hariri family, his companies, and various associates. Hariri had gained control of one of the most prominent pieces of territory in Lebanon without firing a bullet, and all in the name of business. And the reconstruction was also associated, according to Matt Deasy, with the astonishing increase in the activities of the repressive state apparatus. Many property owners who refused to exchange their property rights were violently dispossessed of their claims. And most notably in 1996, 15 people died following the collapse of a building that media at the time accused Solidaire of weakening the foundations of. No one was prosecuted. So rather than act as an engine for the national economy, Solidaire has become a source not only of the extraction of wealth, but a dead space. I call Solidaire paradise in a box, Rania Sassine, a former employee of Solidaire International, told me on her walking tour of the Solidaire area called Beauty Under Stress, practicing public space in Beirut Central District. The tour starts across the road from the Solidaire area on George Haddad Highway. That links to a ring road and forms part of an open trench road that encircles the territory of the corporation and the BCD. It was one of the first infrastructural projects that Solidaire undertook. Rania told me that she starts the tour by crossing the highway to highlight how Solidaire was cut out from the rest of the city. I call it a sensation tour. You know the difference in smell and acoustics, in texture of being on this unfriendly highway and then getting into this very narrow street. With flowers on the side and no noise, there is shade. It is like in a quarter of a second, life has changed radically, and the quality of life has changed radically. Solidaire is now a place of extreme luxury, shut off from the rest of the city. Even Bahij Tabara, who designed the legal framework for Solidaire, lamented that the area is just for rich people. It is not part of Beirut that is for living. It is not for life. Conduct is closely monitored within Solidaire by private security guards. Signs attempt to dictate rules and codes of behaviour. And it's important to note that Solidaire was not merely undertaking a reconstruction of the built environment, nor was it simply a business enterprise. It established new and distinct relationships between Beirut's inhabitants and their broader urban and national fabrics. It also formed new ways of relating to the state and the market. it constructed infrastructures of social relationships as much as it was building roads and telecommunication networks. Critically, these new relationships aimed at increasing social power of certain groups, largely connected to one echelon over others. Now the fog of Reconstruction has receded, it is all too clear how the Reconstruction in Lebanon was never aimed at rebuilding the social contract or establishing a post-conflict era. Rather, it was part of an accumulation of social power by one faction over others. The Reconstruction was one that often resulted in violence against the built environment and its inhabitants through the destruction of construction. So, Reconstruction is really not necessarily the mark of a post-war era. It too can be part of conflict by competing groups and result in socio-political and economic violence against civilian populations. Critically, the example that Lebanon has set is that a reconstruction that is technically and architecturally refined, but built on unethical and unjust governance and political, economic, institutional structures, will not forge peace or social cohesion. The link between Reconstruction and post-conflict eras is not something that should be assumed, but rather needs to be forged. And importantly, the corporation is taking a prominent role in the vast number of reconstructions underway in the region. The question of Solidaire and the utilisation of a joint stock corporation in this way has important contemporary resonances. In relation to the 2008 global financial crisis, Adam Tooze has illuminated a new macro financial economics in which national economic aggregates are being replaced by a focus on corporate balance sheets, where the real action in the financial system is, he says. The overwhelming majority of private credit creation is done by a tight-knit corporate oligarchy. So corporate power is central to the organisation and production of our built fabrics more broadly, but also increasingly in the context of reconstruction projects. And it's important to note that even in our digital world, the very material world of real estate and infrastructure account for a huge share of total marketable wealth worldwide. Real estate is not only the largest single form of wealth, it is also the most important form of collateral for borrowing. And this is certainly reflected in the contemporary organisation of the Middle East. Along with China, the Middle East has perhaps been one of the most rapidly urbanising places on the planet. From 2006 to 16, for instance, cement production has almost doubled in the region's major cement-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Turkey. In the UAE and Lebanon, construction accounts for around 17% of GDP. And in Lebanon, 70% of gross fixed capital formation. This is all the more important today because one of the main threats to Lebanon is potentially the collapse of the real estate and reconstruction sector. And the rise of real estate and construction in the Middle East has been central to various forms of social power, and we've seen all of these various cities be announced throughout the region. And you can see the vast concentration of wealth that has now been expanded into stock markets in this graph. So today, if you look at the skyline of downtowns throughout the Middle East, in particular in the Gulf cities like Dubai and Doha, but also in Beirut, Cairo and Casablanca, the Joint Stock Corporation has transformed the urban landscape. The corporation makes itself present by the proliferation of its urban mega projects, including skyscrapers, downtown developments and gated communities, retail malls and artificial islands, airports and ports, and highways. The urban corporation and the capitalization of urban space is central to many political projects and impositions of social power in the region. This urban corporate expansion is particularly important, though, as I've said, in relation to the contemporary efforts around reconstruction. But this is my final and very first cut attempt to map out some of the reconstruction costs in the region. And it's very much an ongoing project to kind of untangle the various data. This is from mainly UN and World Bank data out there, but some government data as well. But I just want to give you an extent And because this is 2000, I unfortunately don't have the Lebanese Civil War. But the Lebanese Civil War, the reconstruction costs are around $12 billion to 20. But again, part of the problem of unpacking this is I'm really interested in the built environment and physical, or the mainly called physical costs, which is not always easy to untangle. And as I said, this is very much a process that I'm doing. For instance, with Syria, of course, estimates range from 388 billion, but there have also been estimates of 1 trillion. Iraq and Afghanistan have been a bit easier to untangle, especially this is 2000, because there's accounts that have been processed and that I can then analyze those documents of actual expenditure. I mean, of course, this is a talk in itself, but just to give you some idea, and again, the Marshall Plan, which was the American aid project to Europe after the Second World War, was 103 billion. And another important point to add was that this really was mainly for physical reconstruction with some debt forgiveness. Whereas a lot of the reconstruction packages that we see get bandied about in the media mainly actually involve funding for police and security forces. The actual amount of physical reconstruction is it's even really difficult to see where that is going. Because it's almost an afterthought. So when you're seeing these figures circulated in the media, it really often a huge chunk of that is for security sector reconstruction, rule of law issues, rather than actual physical reconstruction. And just to finally emphasize how important the Solidaire model it seems to be becoming, especially for these reconstructions. That law number 10 that was just announced in Syria authorizes cities and towns in the country to earmark zones within their administrative boundaries to create real estate corporations to oversee design and implementation of reconstruction projects. And this is in a country that is traditionally very state-centered. So they see these corporations as mechanisms through which to expand state power, and that's important in terms of the co-production that the corporation enables. So can anything be done to ensure that this vast reconstruction that's going to be happening in future generations will be done in a way that does not cause further violence against the region's inhabitants? And can corporate forms be organised in a way that does not steal the futures of those it should provide for? I hope that we'll be pushing for those to be answered positively, but obviously we live in rather depressing times. Thank you.